Hey everybody, how's it going? Welcome back to my channel, Reading in the Dark. Byron here. This is going to be my May and June retro wrap-up. I'm actually close to catching up on the current moment of life, which is actually August, in case you weren't aware. So it is Madonna's birthday, August 16th. Happy birthday, Madonna. All right, so in May, I hauled, looks like 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7 books. In June, I hauled 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11, 12, 13, 14, 15, 16 books. And between May and June, I believe I actually only read 5, which is a little upsetting. Part of May, I was actually still on vacation, so I got back, well, just the first month. I got back from vacation the second week of May. And yeah, May was when I started really kind of buying too many books and like more than I could handle. This is also a period of time during which I started reading Fire from Heaven by Mary Renault, and that was a very slow process for me reading that book. And so I'm just going to dive right into the book haul portion of this video. In May, I hauled The Other Side of Everything by Doyle Owens. And this is sort of like a thriller, murder investigation, character study novel, which is set in Florida, which was neat since I live here. And it is billed as a literary suspense novel, and I actually really enjoyed it. The second book I hauled was John Adams by David McCullough, obviously a biography of John Adams, which is pretty well thought of. I believe it is the recipient of the Pulitzer Prize. I then hauled Whistling Past the Graveyard by Susan Crandell, which is a story set in the South in the 60s, and it follows the exploits of a young girl named Starla, who runs away from home and has adventures and sees the reality of segregation up close. Also then I bought, what was next? Prime Directive. Okay, I actually didn't buy this. This is a paperback of Prime Directive right here that I found at my parents' house. So I'm putting this in my haul, even though I didn't buy this book. And it technically wasn't new to me, but it had been so many years that, I mean, really, it was new to me. This was mine when I was a kid. But so I bought this, I brought this home, and replaced it pretty soon with the hardcover version. And I'm glad I did because I ended up really liking this book. The next book that I hauled was All Systems Red by Martha Wells. On a distant planet, a team of scientists are conducting surface tests shadowed by their company-supplied droid, a self-aware unit that has hacked its own governor module and refers to itself, although never out loud, as Murderbot. Scornful of humans, all it really wants is to be left alone. When a neighboring mission goes dark, it's up to the scientists and their Murderbot to get to the truth. So I'm thinking possibly some AI turning against the creators situation may be happening there. I have not read this yet. The next book I bought was The Wild Inside by Christine Carbo. This is a story about a man who, it says he's a special agent for the Department of the Interior investigating a mauling, and this special agent named Ted actually witnessed his father get mauled and carried off by a grizzly bear when he was 14. However, turns out that in this thriller, it appears the mauling may actually not be completely just a mauling. The next book that I bought was Eileen by Ottessa Moshfegh, which I read and loved and will review momentarily. Now on to June. I purchased a whole bunch of ebooks in June, so let's get to that. Ancillary Justice by Leckie. Most people know all about this. This series is really, really well known for having a really cool sort of gender fluidity in the future. On a remote, icy planet, the soldier known as Breck is drawing closer to completing her quest. Once, she was the Justice of Torin, a colossal starship with an AI linking thousands of soldiers. Now, an act of treachery has ripped it all away, leaving her with one fragile human body, unanswered questions, and a burning desire for vengeance. So basically, it's the disembodied AI of a destroyed starship in a human body now, I think trying to track down and figure out what happened to her ship. I then bought in June 2 books in the Star Trek The Next Generation series called Stargazer, which was the name of the ship that the Patrick Stewart Captain Picard, served on prior to being on the Enterprise. And the series is called Stargazer, and this first book in the Stargazer series is called Gauntlet by Michael Jan Friedman. I also purchased the second book in the Stargazer series called Progenitor by Michael Jan Friedman. I bought a book called Blindness by José Saramago, which is about an outbreak of blindness that is sort of sweeping around the world like a virus or any other kind of communicable disease. It's white blindness, though. Instead of people's vision going dark, it all goes bright. So all they can see is just bright white light everywhere. And it looked really, really interesting to me. I read like the sample, which was the first chapter. It says, a city is hit by an epidemic of white blindness that spares no one. Authorities confined the blind to an empty mental hospital. It's a story about a plague, and it seemed like it was really beautifully written, so I'm looking forward to Blindness. I also bought a book called The One by John Mars, and this is a kind of a silly sounding but potentially interesting sounding sort of futuristic story where they do DNA tests to match your DNA to someone else and find the perfect lover for you. I don't know, I think this was an ebook that I saw that was on sale, and I was curious enough about it to give it a shot. It doesn't actually sound like it's totally up my alley, but so that is The One by John Mars. Luna, New Moon by Ian McDonald was one of the books I was considering for my book Tubathon challenge, and now I kind of wish I had chosen it, because I read Nixia instead, and The Moon Wants to Kill You, it says. This is about a group of people who are mining helium for a huge helium-3 industry on the moon. There's a huge corporation that's in charge, and now in the twilight of her life, this woman who is in charge of that corporation finds her company confronted by the many enemies she made during her meteoric rise. If her family is to survive, her 5 children must defend her empire from her many enemies and each other. Apparently this is a really great series. It's been described as sort of like Game of Thrones in space. I next bought Embassytown by China Miéville. Humans have colonized a distant planet home to the enigmatic Arike, sentient beings famed for a language unique in the universe, one that only a few altered human ambassadors can speak. When distant political machinations deliver a new ambassador to Arieka, the fragile equilibrium between humans and aliens is violently upset. Catastrophe looms, and Aviche is torn between competing loyalties to a husband she no longer loves, to a system she no longer trusts, and to her place in a language she cannot speak yet speaks through her. So none of that really makes much sense to me, but it was nominated for a Hugo Award, and that, I guess, is good enough for me to give it a shot. I then bought In a Cottage in a Wood by Cass Green. It says, a strange encounter. Neve comes across a troubled woman called Isabel on Waterloo Bridge late one night. Isabel forces a parcel into Neve's hands and jumps to her death in the icy Thames below. So this is a thriller, and I'm going to leave it at that. So the next book that I bought was actually the third part of the Genesis Wave series for Star Trek The Next Generation, an audiobook, which I have already reviewed. It was mediocre, by John Vornholt. Sorry, John. Didn't love it. The next book that I bought was Hannah Green and Her Unfeasibly Mundane Existence by Michael Marshall Smith. This is a young adult novel about a young girl who realizes that her grandfather has been in communication and in league with the devil her whole life, and now they need her help. I don't know any more than that. It was part of my book Tubathon reading challenge, which I didn't get to, and it's the next book I'm going to read after I finish the 6th book in my challenge, which was the George R.R. Martin prequel to the Game of Thrones Song of Ice and Fire series. So I'm about to read that, but I haven't read it yet. The next book in my haul was The History of Bees by Maja Lunde. In the spirit of Station 11 and Never Let Me Go, this dazzling and ambitious literary debut follows 3 generations of beekeepers from the past, present, and future, weaving a spellbinding story of their relationship to the bees and to their children and one another against the backdrop of an urgent global crisis. It's dystopian, and the most future portion of the story, which takes place in China in 2098, is in a world where there are no more bees, and people have to paint pollen onto fruit trees in order to keep things going. And I think this is at least the 2nd book I've heard of that has this bee concept as a central theme. It seems to be a recurring theme in dystopian literature. The Changeling by Victor Laval. One man's thrilling journey through an enchanted world to find his wife, who has disappeared after seemingly committing an unforgivable act of violence. Should be very interesting. It's sort of like a mystery, fantasy, thriller situation. The next book I bought was Woman in the Window by A.J. Finn, which is a thriller that everyone and their mother has read and is always talking about, and I got it on sale for $4. So I figured, what the hell, I'm going to read it too. and it's gonna storm outside apparently. And so I'm gonna read that book, and I'm sure it'll be fun and a page turner. And you've heard enough about Woman in the Window. I don't think I need to go into too much detail about that one. Interview with the Vampire by Anne Rice. Again, kind of a classic. I loved the movie, and I just wanted to actually finally read it. I've never read anything by Anne Rice, so that should be an interesting experience. I then bought The King Must Die by Mary Renault. The King Must Die is a book about Theseus. It's part of a series of books that she wrote about Theseus. In myth, Theseus was the slayer of the child-devouring Minotaur in Crete. What the founder hero might have been in real life is another question brilliantly explored in The King Must Die. Drawing on modern scholarship and archaeological findings, Mary Renault's Theseus is an utterly lifelike figure, a king of immense charisma whose boundless strivings flow from strength and weakness, but also one steered by implacable prophecy. So I really enjoyed reading the first book in the Alexander the Great series by Mary Renault, entitled Fire from Heaven. And although it was hard to get to because my history knowledge has lots of gaps in it, I really enjoyed it. I really enjoyed her writing, and so I wanted to read more by Mary Renault, and so The King Must Die. The final book that I purchased in June was A Density of Souls by Christopher Rice, and this is obviously a thriller. And I've read one more book by him, a book called The Snow Garden, which I am going to reread because I don't really remember it, but I remember enjoying it. And A Density of Souls, I think, is a favorite of a friend of mine, and is a thriller that really kind of capitalizes on Christopher Rice's involvement in the gay community and has a lot of gay characters in it, and is really popular for that reason, and I'm just curious to read that book. So that was the last book that I hauled. So those are the books that I hauled in the months of May and June. There's a lot of thrillers, there's a lot of sci-fi and crossovers, sort of like literary suspense, literary sci-fi dystopian stuff in there. I've definitely noticed that I'm kind of gravitating towards books that are a little bit dark, a little bit melancholy, a little bit sad, dark, gritty, disturbing. I don't know why. I'm a happy person, I swear. In any case, in terms of the books that I actually read, there's a storm, y'all. The first book that I read in May was Ilsa by Madeleine L'Engle. This book was actually originally published in 1946. It's not science fiction, it's not fantasy, it's not young adult, it's not the kind of thing that this author became famous for later after A Wrinkle in Time. This book is about a man named Henry who grows up with this very enigmatic and fascinating woman, this character named Ilsa, and is basically in love with her and obsessed with her his entire life. It doesn't come across as in a depressing way. It's just a fascinating sort of character study. This is a book that L'Engle was not super proud of. She kind of didn't want it republished, and I think of all of her novels, it's the only one that never was. So it was only recently republished. I really loved this book. I gave it 5 stars. In terms of the sort of not letting go and trying and pushing and the sort of desperation or obsession that he has with this woman, and how many years they know each other, and the sort of trials and tribulations that go along with the world around them and their relationship to one another, and how they change over the years but are still in each other's lives for a very, very long time. That was very meaningful to me, and I can certainly relate to the idea of unrequited love, who can't, and the sort of question of where is the line between loyalty and self-respect. I think it's a really beautiful book, and I really loved it. Second book that I read was The Glass Forest. Now, The Glass Forest is basically, it's about a woman whose husband's brother, her brother-in-law, has disappeared, or he has died. And they go to his house because nobody knows where his wife is. And his wife's name was Celia. A lot of the novel is spent in the sort of distant past, showing the sort of genesis of the relationship between Celia and her husband. And you see sort of the slow crumbling of their relationship, and you see how tension forms between them as Celia becomes a lot more independent and successful and sort of starts to outshine her husband. There are elements of that relationship and of that character that remind me quite a bit of Mildred Pierce. I will say that I found the ending of the story a little anticlimactic, but I really enjoyed the character study of the woman who has disappeared and the sort of exploration of their marriage. That was more interesting to me than the story that was in the present tense between the narrator of the present tense portion of the book and her husband, the deceased man's brother, which is usually the case for me when I read a book that's set in the present tense and also, or in the present day and also set partially in the past. I'm usually more intrigued by the past section, and that was true here. I felt that Cynthia Swanson sort of dropped the ball a little bit with the ending, but I really enjoyed the read, and it was very atmospheric, and I enjoyed the historical aspect of it. So this was a 3-star read for me. The next book I read was Whistling Past the Graveyard. This was published in 2013 by Susan Crandell, written by Susan Crandell. And this is a historical novel set in the 60s about a young girl named Starla Claudel who runs away from home. She teams up with a black woman who is also sort of on the run. And there's some lovely writing. This is a book that was written by a white woman about the black experience in America in the 60s. Personally, I don't completely understand why a white person would choose to write a book like this and take it upon themselves to try and illuminate that experience when it's not their experience and not, in my opinion, their story to tell. A lot of it was very ugly and very difficult to get through, very sort of distressing. And there was a point at which I thought I might put the book away if it didn't clear up, and then it suddenly did. But I think that for all its ambition to be a portrait of segregation in the South during the very, very early days of the Civil Rights Movement, my personal opinion is that the end of the book was a little bit too cheery and uplifting and neat and tidy for the subject matter that it was trying to explore. So I found that disappointing, and I ended up giving Whistling Past the Graveyard also 3 stars. The next book that I read was called The Other Side of Everything by Lauren Doyle Owens. Now, this is a thriller about a series of murders that's taking place in a small community in Florida that is populated almost entirely by octogenarians, elderly people. They're being killed by apparently the same killer, serial killer, is going around and killing these elderly people in this community. And there is an investigation going on, but the book does not follow the homicide investigators. The book does not follow the cops and the heroic aspect, the sort of glamorous aspect of murder investigations that are so commonly dramatized on TV and in books. This is actually about the community, and it's about some of the people in the neighborhood who have lived there their whole lives. That is what I loved about it. I loved the history of the neighborhood, the history of the people who live in the community, the memories that they have of living there for so many years and knowing one another. This book is a really cool exploration of memory, community, and aging, and mortality and death. And I thought it was really beautifully done. The mystery was interesting and fun, surprised me. And I loved the fact that it was sort of a cozy story and it was very character-driven as opposed to being glamorous and sexy and breathless and cool like most thrillers, so I gave this book 4 stars. The last book that I read was Eileen by Ottessa Moshfegh, and I might do a separate review for this book. Just did a long review for her most recent book, My Year of Rest and Relaxation, which I loved. Eileen is a very dark and very gritty, funny story. This is a story about a young woman who lives with her alcoholic father, who is a barely functioning alcoholic, who really only leaves the house to maybe get the mail, if he even does that, and she is responsible for keeping him in liquor and taking care of him and cleaning up his vomit, that sort of thing. He's a retired police officer. She works at a boys' prison, and her life is pretty dark and pretty gray and pretty boring. She's a sort of odd, introverted young woman who is very uncomfortable with her own physical body, with her sexuality, and she's very quiet and keeps to herself. And then this very vivacious, bright, beautiful, clever, quirky woman named Rebecca is hired to work at the prison and sort of opens up her perceptions to the world and opens up her world and changes everything. I really, really liked this book. I fell in love with Ottessa Moshfegh when I read it. It's funny to think of it as a thriller. I guess it's sort of called that. It's sort of thoughtful and luxurious in how it explores this character and her inner thoughts and the way she sees herself and others in the world, that it feels more like a character study, and I suppose you could call it literary suspense. But I'm quickly learning that Ottessa Moshfegh just has her own thing. But it's a very interesting read. It's a very good book. It was a very quick read for me. That said, I gave it 4 stars instead of 5 stars, even though I thought it was so well written, just because it does deal really, really well with a portrayal of alcoholism, which is something that I unfortunately know plenty about from some people in my life that I love very much. So I gave it 4 stars just because for me, it was hard to get through some of those passages. So that's Eileen. I'm a fan of the book. I'm a fan of Moshfegh, and I'm actually about to read her novella McCullough, which I think is a very similar tone going on, so we'll see how I feel about it. But yes, Eileen. Very, very lovely book. Great writing. Enjoyed it. 4 stars. So those are all of the books that I read in May and June, and I am going to do a catch-up video, a wrap-up on July, and then hopefully try to actually be current with these videos now. I'm getting pretty close at this point. I am currently reading this lovely book right here, A Knight of the Seven Kingdoms by George R.R. Martin. It is the sort of 3 separate, previously published novellas that are prequels to A Song of Fire and Ice, which is the series that Game of Thrones, the TV show, is based on. The Game of Thrones book series, A Song of Fire and Ice, or Ice and Fire, is set, it says 100 years after this book. I'm a little confused. It doesn't seem like it can be quite 100, but many years. And as a fan of the TV show, but having never read those books, I guess I've started in the right place, and I am really enjoying this. I read the first third of this, the first novella of the 3, in one sitting last night, and really enjoyed it. So that's what's going on with me right now. I'm still sort of every once in a while picking up the collected short stories, novellas and tales of Henry James and reading them, but that's not something that I'm trying to read straight through with any speed. I'm just reading it every once in a while. So the book I'm reading in earnest is A Knight of the Seven Kingdoms right now, and I'm enjoying it. So that is my wrap-up for May and June 2018. And if you enjoyed this video, please feel free to hit the like button or subscribe below. I really appreciate everybody checking my video out. And until next time, remember to drink more coffee, read more books, and don't forget to sleep. Thanks, guys. See you in the next video. I should go check out the storm, because I think it might be